Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. In tonight's episode, we cover 5 hair-raising encounters with Bigfoot Sasquatch and what others believe to be some wild beast in the wilderness, from footprints found in the wintertime to having rocks and logs thrown at you. So be sure to like, share and subscribe. Let the encounters begin. Story 1, born and raised in Oklahoma and have been my whole life. I grew up fishing, tracking everything you could possibly want to do in the outdoors. My entire family is that way, and I raised my boys the same way. However, I've never been one to believe in all of the silly fairy tales that people spew about Bigfoot and other silly animals that live in the woods and apparently exist until one day, me and my oldest son had a strange encounter when we went to go fishing at one of our local creeks we like to frequent. It was a beautiful sunny day in June of '99, and we thought we'd make a good day of it and go pack some food and have a good day fishing. Just father and son. Well, we got everything loaded up and got the tackle box and our poles and headed out the creek we were heading to. It's roughly about 20 minutes away from our house, since we kind of live a little bit out of town. When we got to the creek, all seemed well and lively. The water was rushing pretty quick even though it was June. The stream was still ice cold, which is always great to stick your feet into just after getting there, and you've been walking around and it's very hot. This particular spot, it's a pretty typical creek bed, but there is a lot of bushes and brush scattered throughout the area. And I'm talking tall bushes that are like 6 to 7 feet tall. It's definitely not clear and open, so you have to kind of find a nice spot along the riverbank to fish. We found a nice spot to sit down, and we begin to unpack our food and get our tackle box and pools all set up. As I'm sitting there helping my son, I noticed my son's attention is not on what we're doing. Instead, he's looking over my shoulder with the most confused look on his face, seeming quite distracted. I thought that was pretty odd since my son's favourite pastime is fishing, and I never lose his attention to anything other than fishing. So I turned my head to see what he's looking at, and I think maybe it's a bear or something. But I was wrong. About 30 feet away, behind a 5 bush, was this face peeking out, staring at both of us. It looked humanoid, but also had a very Neanderthal-like quality to it, with hair all around it, and more of a cone-shaped kind of hair. The cheeks were bare, and the skin looked very leathery, but there was hair all over the face. The eyes were dark, and I couldn't really make out any pupils. Its nose was like ours, not like a gorilla's. I wasn't really sure what it was at first. Once it realized both of us were staring at it, it immediately popped its head back down. My son starts freaking out, wondering what on earth that was looking at us. I was starting to freak out a little bit too, but I just wanted to chalk it up to somebody playing a treat trick on us with some sort of stupid Hollywood mask. So I yelled out, "Whoever you are, leave now, I have a gun on me," and this thing, faster than I could have ever imagined, bolted out from behind this bush into the wood line about another 70 to 80 feet. Now I want to remind you that this is total daylight, so we're able to see everything pretty clearly. This thing was about 5 to 6 feet tall and pretty hairy. I mean, I'm talking full black hair. If a black bear could be walking on 2 legs and running like a human could, you would pretty much be nailing it, except for the cone-shaped head and no neck. It didn't really look like it had much of a neck, and its arms swayed back and forth. It was also very barrel-body shaped and built like a tank. It never looked back as it ran, and I've never seen anyone or anything run so fast. As soon as it hit the wood line, it disappeared. My son, for the rest of the day, kept wondering what on earth it was that we saw. I told him that we would talk about it later and to try and just enjoy our fishing trip. Well, we didn't really fish there for long before he was just too uncomfortable, and so we left to go back home on the drive home. My son is in a stupor, and he asked me, did we see a Bigfoot? I told him that Bigfoot isn't real, and it must have just been somebody trying to pull a prank on us. Looking back, I was really naive to think that I've told this encounter to a couple of friends of mine who are Bigfoot enthusiasts, and they informed me that what I probably experienced was a juvenile Bigfoot, since it appeared a lot more curious and playful than it ever did territorial or aggressive in any way. I'm not really freaked out now, but whatever it was very strange. I felt weird for me and my son seeing what it was now that my son is all grown up. He still goes fishing in that exact same spot. But we've never really talked about the experience since, and I've never brought it back up. Story 2. This is a story that my grandfather had told me back from when he was younger. He's had property in his generation for a long time, and him and his father used to hunt on their property out in Texas. As of currently, our family had moved to Minnesota, and that is where we've been currently residing for a long time. We actually don't even visit the old property anymore and have it in ages. My grandfather has been hunting since he was just a boy, and so he's a fairly experienced woodsman who doesn't really ever fear much. It still gives me chills to this day to hear this encounter because my grandfather still gets shaken up every time he recounts it. My grandfather hunted all sorts of game deer, coyotes, squirrels, you name it. They had a lot of property to work with. So he had a lot of time on his hands to really learn the woods around him and get a good feel for the game in the area. There's even wild turkey that would run around there from time to time. So there was plenty to hunt all season long. This particular day ended with him taking a route that he didn't normally take to venture out to a different part of the property that he wasn't used to. Him and his father had several different routes. They would take on their property to go venture off in different spots, to go hunt after making it maybe a mile is when he started to hear strange vocalizations and other bizarre noises in the woods around him. At first he told me he thought it was a bird, but he said there's no birds in the woods that sound like these noises did. They would come and go. So he kind of wrote them off at first, but they started getting louder and more frequent. But he kept venturing further because my grandfather isn't afraid of anything after venturing. Maybe another mile is when he started to get hit with a very strong skunk musk odor that was said to smell like rotting meat and skunk. My grandfather described it like coming upon a pile of 100 dead rotting skunks just sitting in the sun and baking. He said it was so strong there'd be times it was hard not to want to gag and vomit. He said he kept looking around but didn't see anything but started to get the overwhelming feeling that he was being watched. At this point he knew something was up. He couldn't find the trace of the smell and things were getting more eerie as time went on. He also told me that as he ventured around the area, there were times where he would run into stuff that didn't quite look right, like markers that weren't quite man-made, is what he said, like they might have in markings from animals or something. He told me about how he found smaller trees that were ripped up out of the ground and turned upside down and pulled back into the ground. What's scary is this is back in the 1940s, and their property was pretty large, as well as being private, so nobody was going to be hanging out on their property doing anything like this. And if so, who's going to rip up all these small trees out of the ground, and who's going to have enough strength to drive them back into the ground? This was really unsettling. My grandfather also believes he stumbled upon a small den of whatever it was he was smelling. He said he also found a small cave opening that opened up into a cave that he estimated to be roughly 30 square feet. But the stench of the dead skunk smell was where it was coming from. He also said he could see bones just from the cave entrance alone and decided it was probably a good idea to head back home. Although they were the bones of deer from what he gathered, he didn't want to take any chances. He told me that as he was leaving the den, he started to get an extremely overwhelming feeling of dread and felt the need to get the hell out of there. That's when he noticed rocks starting to be thrown in his direction. And I'm not talking about little pebbles. I'm talking rocks the size of a tire literally being thrown through the woods about 10-20 feet near him. This was obviously enough, so he was so scared. He booked it out of there and got back home as fast as he could. He said whatever was throwing those rocks at him had to be incredibly strong and obviously not a human. He said there was some sort of stomping and screaming noises that were going on as soon as he was leaving the den. Something was trying to drive him out of the area, and whatever it was close by. He tells me there were multiple of these things, not even 50 FDA, but he couldn't see them after that. He still continues to hunt on his property, but not near as much as he used to, and he never went beyond where he went before. He continued to stay in new areas. His father never said much about it, and I guess there was never really a whole lot to discuss since. Back then, especially, you'd be practically crazy if he ever brought it up. The property ended up getting passed down to him once his father died, and not long after that, he moved to Minnesota due to his career. Story 3. My fiancé and I love camping and always do stuff in the outdoors. We're usually pretty avid hikers and explorers. We've gone through many different trails, hikes, and many adventures out in the woods. I've never noticed anything out of the ordinary or even at a place, although I am a firm believer in the paranormal and Bigfoot and other weird occurrences that do happen. Although I've never really experienced them until this particular event that I'm about to talk to you about. Me and my fiancée decided to camp at one of our favourite lakes, Lake Dewey in Michigan. We've camped here several times before and have always had a great experience. So this time would be no different, or so we thought. It was later September, and I remember because it was still pretty warm, but the cold crisp in the air of fall had not yet set in. We had a pretty typical fun day on the lake. We hung out, we hiked, we hung out in our tent before going back out and hiking again, and then coming back for dinner to relax for the evening. But by the end of the first night, my boyfriend was acting strained. He was getting really quiet and not talking as much as he normally does, which I just chalked it up to him being exhausted. Since we did had a long day, we ended up putting out the fire and turning in for the night. I noticed he seemed on edge and had a rough time falling asleep, but he didn't mention anything. Even when I asked him if he was okay, I sacked right out and woke up the next morning. No problems, feeling well rested and ready to take on the next day. Him not so much. He didn't look so good and seemed like he was still on edge from yesterday after getting up and eating breakfast. And going on the next hike, the day seemed pretty normal, and we decided to get ready to go back to camp as it was starting to become later in the afternoon. That's when he sat me down and told me that he had been feeling uncomfortable since yesterday. When I asked him what was wrong, he just said he didn't feel right about where we were, and that he felt like we were being looked at and watched very closely. I assured him that he was just paranoid, and it was silly to think like that. Nothing was out here. Nothing was going to get us. I convinced him to stay with me another night, but he seemed so apprehensive about it. Now it was bothering me how weird he was acting, because it's not like him. Usually he's one of those guys that is the first to come up with crazy hiking trails and spots for us to check out. He was always the first one of us to want to explore dangerous territory and stuff that were never meant to be explored. This night was a little calmer, and I feel like we both checked in a little earlier than normal. I ended up staying up and thinking around on my cell phone while my boyfriend just laid there trying to fall asleep. The evening had been pretty dead. We hadn't really talked a whole lot after heading back to camp. It was just kind of blah after he sat me down and told me what he did earlier. I had been kind of on edge, but just try to play it off. It was pretty late at night if I remember right. I want to say my phone said something like 11:32, and this is where we started to hear footsteps go through our campsite, and I mean heavy footsteps, and then the breathing started. I started to feel really uneasy, and I just kept hearing a thud for every step that was taken. I started to panic because I wasn't sure if this was a bear we were dealing with or someone who was trying to hurt us. I looked over to my boyfriend and asked him if he heard what I was hearing, and he was already as white as a ghost and nodded right at me. I sat there scared, looking at the door of my tent, trying to listen for any sound I could. The sound had ceased for a while, and all I heard was the night air. The stomping would stop for a couple of moments, and then it would resume. Whatever it was stomping around in circles around our tent, but it wasn't really getting into any of our stuff like a bear would. It's like it was casing our tent or something. It made me feel so nervous. Whatever it was kept getting really close to the tent, and we could hear it breathing heavily. It must have been huge, because it sounded like it was a 10F tall man. Either that, or it was a bison on 2 legs walking around our campsite for the next few hours. This would go on and off until roughly 3 or 4 in the morning, and we could finally fall asleep. We didn't even notice the noises stopping, and the feeling of dread went away. I think my boyfriend and I fell asleep from just sheer exhaustion and panic. We still do not talk about it to this day, and when we got up the next morning, we didn't even speak. We just booked it out of there and packed up as quickly as we could. It had been a Bigfoot from what we saw or heard. Probably could have been someone rummaging through our camp. I don't know, whatever it was. I don't think I'll ever go back to that lake story for. Me and my brother Travis have been going out hunting together for as long as I can remember, back when my poor, God rest his soul, used to take us when we were little. He always told us how impressed he was because of how quickly we were able to catch on and learn about the area around us and things. We would notice like tracks, markings, sounds. It was great. We didn't actually start going hunting though with him until we were a little older, around 9 or 10, and we instantly fell in love with it. Our paw passed away from cancer when we were roughly about 17 and 16 respectively. Since my little brother is only about a year and a half younger than I, and it just quite hasn't been the same since. So, to honour that me and my brother make it a ritual to try and go out together every year and hunt and keep it going, the family line depends on it. Our uncle has had some property that has been passed down for quite a few generations that me and my brother and Paul have hunted on for ages these past 5 years. Specifically though, we had been going to different places to hunt, and it just wasn't quite the same as our uncle's property. So this year we had decided we were going to go back to our uncle's and give it a go. We contacted him and got the okay. And we'd shown up there in the early morning. Luckily for us, there's several different tree stands set up all throughout my uncle's property. He's got about 80 plus acres of just deep woods. We're in Montana after all, and a really nice cabin-style house that we sometimes like to sleep, and when we visit before we go out camping anyway, we knew this time, the usual tree stands we wanted to hit. We got there that early morning and got all geared up and ready to go. It was clear my brother was going to take a stand about a half-mile away from the stand I was in. We were both going to go in about 2 to 3 miles deep into the woods to get to this one specific spot we both knew of. It was actually a pretty good clearing, and there are many bucks, and does that were usually sighted here. So we knew this was the prime spot. We got all ready and headed out to the designated spots. We needed to go. I wished my brother luck, and he did to me as well. I climbed up into my tree stand once I made it, and sat there, and I waited. Usually when I get to my tree stand, it's hard for me to not want to get totally relaxed and just be comfortable. I love it. I love it being out in nature and hunting. That's where I belong. And I've always felt so at peace. The sunlight was barely breaking through. It couldn't have been any later than 5 or 6, 0 am. I don't remember exactly. I thought it was weird though that I didn't notice any wildlife really teeming in the area as we had made our hike back to these stands. I didn't think anything of it at the time though. An hour had gone by and nothing. The woods were so unusually quiet and all the life, and it was gone. I mean, there wasn't a sign of anything around. I thought it was so odd. It was a lot long after that I started hearing weird noises coming through the woods. I couldn't really place a direction around me to where it was coming from. I just knew it was coming around me from close by. I just figured at first that it was a big buck finally coming through the area since it sounded so heavy. I kept hearing brush crushing and twigs snapping. The only issue is the heavy thudding and footsteps I was hearing didn't sound like it was coming from a 4-footed animal. It sounded like it was a heavy person, but it sounded way too heavy to be a person. I started to hear what I can only describe as whooping-like noises and other strange sounds. I started to get nervous. The sounds began getting louder and louder, and as I looked out of my tree stand to see if I could spot what it was, I locked eyes on it. Coming into the woods from the clearing, not even 50 yards away from me, was this giant, hairy man. I quickly ducked my head down to make sure it didn't see me, and every step it took was a deep thud, and I could hear it wheezing and breathing hard. I heard it walk its way towards me, and then, as it approached my stand and got close, it slowed down. I was so terrified, I wasn't sure what to do. I gripped my rifle tightly, praying I wouldn't have to use it in this confrontation because I knew I wouldn't make it standing out against this thing. It slowly passed underneath me and kept on going. I waited for it to be gone completely before I even moved a muscle. It felt like an eternity. I quickly opened the hatch and got done out of my stand, and by instinct I ran to my brother's stand where I knew he'd be only being half a mile away. I knew it wouldn't be too far, and if I can get past the thing that walked right under my stand, I would probably be okay. The woods were still quiet, which made me so nervous because that means it was still in the area. I made it to my brother's stand in probably 10 minutes or even less. He was also as pale as a ghost. I explained to him what had happened and he didn't really say much. He just said we needed to leave, and so we hightailed it out of there. I've been hunting for years and years, and I've never seen anything or encountered anything like I did that morning. It wasn't until we got back to the truck that my brother was telling me. He saw the same thing walking near History Stand, and that he doesn't believe this creature saw him or even meant any harm. He's probably right, but it's something that I don't want to have happen ever again. It honestly scared me to death, and I haven't been able to go back to my uncle's property and hunt since my brother was able to get over it and move on, but he will never talk about it. And since then, we've found other areas and places to hunt on. I think we kind of just collectively have decided to not go back, even if it is kind of an unspoken rule. Whatever is running around in my uncle's property, keep it far away from me. Story 5, when I was in my early 20s, I loved going out in the wintertime and exploring as much as I could. It was my favourite season to go out and hiking. Everything was so magical, and even though it was cold, the temperature and climates never pushed me away. Even though most people never went outdoors in that time, I always dressed accordingly. My favourite thing would be to go down all the abandoned logging roads and just pull off and start exploring. Usually those are the best parts because so much of those woods around there are untouched. Of course I like to really go and explore just about every season. There is, but winter is just so unique. I'm not really a hunter by trade or a woodsman. I just like to hike and explore, but I do have many good friends that are avid outdoorsmen and hunters. Now there's always something to see and explore, no matter really what season you're in. I often take weapons with me like elephant knives and such, just in case I would run into a bear or a mountain lion, or anything that would put me in a bad situation in this particular time. As I was exploring the area around, I came across what appeared to be extremely large tracks down by this little frozen river a few miles into the woods. I've always been pretty neutral about the whole Bigfoot phenomena, but this was amazing to witness firsthand. I don't know if really anybody else comes out this way, and if they do, I seriously doubt they're going to bring a fake foot imprint on the ground. This was a dried up old creek bed that looked like it had been not used for a long time. Like maybe it had dried up years and years ago because the footprints looked like they had been old and frozen. I think what really got me was the overall impression of the footprint. You could tell it was set pretty deep into the frozen ground. Now these footprints weren't exactly in the snow, more so in an area where the snow is receding and the ground was still totally frozen, and it looked like the footprints had been there prior to snowfall. You can tell that whatever made this footprint or these footprints must have been extremely heavy. The footprints had easily been 16 or more and were only faded a little bit, so they were pretty well preserved, but I think that was due to the cold fridge attempts. It was interesting to note that there were 5 clearly defined toes in the footprint as well as no real arch. It was clearly a bipedal footprint. I was looking at the footprints loosely, were around the riverbank and went into the direction of the woods. What's even crazier is the stride. The stride between the footprints was roughly 5'6'4". What on earth would have that kind of stride out here? I didn't really feel like even trying to figure out what it could be. I thought about following the footprints, but I immediately considered that being a bad idea just because 1, I don't know what animal made them, and 2, it was in a totally different direction than the way I wanted to go. I'm an explorer, but I'm not stupid enough to potentially put myself in a dangerous situation, especially when I'm not familiar with what I'm dealing with. I don't have any casting material or any of that stuff with me, nor do I ever carry it, because I don't make molds of tracks. This just happened to be tracks that I happened to run into. I ended up going back to my car sometime later and driving back home. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I have a few friends of mine who are close with me that are Bigfoot enthusiasts. So I brought it up with them, and they were ecstatic that I told them about this. Not only did they tell me I ran into Bigfoot footprints, but they also shared with me some of their own hair-raising encounters that they had out in those same woods. You know, at this point, I don't know if Bigfoots really do exist, but I definitely can say that those footprints are pretty unexplainable, and I have no idea when animal made them. Thank you for watching this video.